The conflict between Israel and Palestinian militants shows no sign of abating, despite reports that the two sides were on the verge of agreeing a ceasefire. At least 6 more Palestinians are reported to have been killed in airstrikes in Gaza. Palestinian militants have fired more rockets into southern Israel and at Tel Aviv.
Airstrikes and rocket fire pushed Israel and Palestinians into a second day of fighting on Saturday, ending more than a year of relative calm along the border. It comes a day after Israel killed a senior commander of the Islamic Jihad militant group in a surprise daytime airstrike on a high-rise building in Gaza City. On Saturday, Israel said it struck Islamic Jihad militants, which had been preparing to launch rockets and militant posts. Witnesses said additional bombings targeted 5 houses. Ibrahim Shamalak's home in Gaza City was destroyed in a strike. He says the Israeli army warned him in advance to evacuate his house before it was hit. In response to Israel's strikes, Palestinian militants fired at least 160 rockets across the border. Most missiles were intercepted and there were no reports of serious casualties, Israel's ambulance service said. The Israeli strikes have killed at least 14 Palestinians, including at least 4 more Islamic Jihad militants and a child. They have also wounded at least 110 people, the Palestinian Health Ministry said. Islamic Jihad did not provide precise details on how many of its members had been killed and signalled no immediate ceasefire. The frontier had been largely quiet since May 2021, when 11 days of fierce fighting between Israel and militants left at least 250 in Gaza and 13 in Israel dead.
Well, for some analysis, we're now joined by Professor Nader Hashemi, who's the Director for the Center of Middle East Studies and Professor of Middle East and Islamic Studies at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver in Colorado in the United States. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. This flare-up that has been taking place since Friday, do we know its origins?
Well, roughly a week ago, Israel arrested a prominent leader of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the West Bank, claiming that he was planning an attack. A few days later, again, claiming that the same group in Gaza was planning to attack Israel. Israel launched an air bombardment of the Gaza Strip, killing a top Palestinian Islamic Jihad commander, which resulted in Palestinian groups firing rockets into Israel. So that's the official Israeli story. But I don't think we should, let this particular flare-up in violence be understood outside of its broader context. And that context is that you have roughly 5 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza living under an apartheid situation, according to Amnesty International. And then you have roughly 9 million other Palestinians who've been dispossessed by Israel, who are living as refugees around the world. So that's what we know.
Where are we in terms of the ceasefire that was supposed to kick off earlier this evening, I'm told?
Well, the latest reports are that there will be a ceasefire that will start 11:30 this evening in Gaza or Israel time. I suspect that ceasefire will probably hold. But the big question is, what about the day after? The day after effectively means for millions of Palestinians returning to a life under siege in Gaza. The siege in Gaza has been in place, backed by the Egyptian government for 15 years. We're talking about one of the most densely populated parts of the world. And then, of course, in the West Bank, you have a situation of ongoing expansion of Israeli settler colonialism and a broader apartheid situation engulfing, the entire Israel-Palestine conflict. So that's what likely is going to happen. And I suspect we'll have a repeat of these types of incidences as we get closer to the November Israeli election. I mean, the big question here is, why did Israel, launch this attack? Was there a preemptive strike? But I think politically speaking, hitting Gaza and claiming that you're a tough Israeli politician who can protect Israel from Palestinian rockets gets you a boost in the opinion polls. So I think that's really what's driving this recent flare-up in tensions between Israelis and Palestinians.
Help us understand the power groupings inside Gaza. We see that in this past week, Hamas has pretty much stayed on the sidelines, and this militant group is the one that's engaged Israel. But sadly, ordinary Palestinians always bear the brunt of all of this. Who is this militant group, and where do they fit into the landscape of power in Gaza?
Well, they're a minority militant group. They have very close ties with Iran. They're financed by the Islamic Republic of Iran. They have a few thousand fighters. They're much smaller militarily compared to Hamas, which dominates the Gaza Strip and has significant support in the West Bank as well. But they're a separate group. They have their own command and control structure. It is safe to say that their numbers and I think their popularity among the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank is growing largely because of what I said a moment ago. The despair, the humiliation, the frustration. It only makes rational sense that people living under a colonial, occupied, apartheid situation will lose despair in the absence of any meaningful hope and a peace process, and will gravitate towards more militant expressions of their frustration. And that's really what this small militant violent group known as the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, that's what they're about, and that's where they derive their support from.
And this loss of life, which is always much heavier on the Palestinian side, Tel Aviv in the meantime will say that all of this is justified. Yeah,
and it just highlights, number one, the gross and colossal disparity in power. Israel is one of the most powerful countries in the Middle East. Even on a global scale, Israel is very powerful. It has the backing of, a major superpower, the United States and the European Union. And on the other side, the Palestinians are effectively abandoned. They have a monumentally corrupt and incompetent internal leadership in Ramallah. And then the previous support that the Palestinians could rely on, at least rhetorically or symbolically, from neighboring Arab states, as we all know, that has withered away as well. All of these Arab dictatorships have struck separate deals with Israel to back up their own sagging legitimacy within their own societies, effectively throwing the Palestinians under the bus. And so right now, the Palestinians have never been weaker, have never been more impoverished, have never been, more frustrated with their collective plight. And sadly, there seems to be no light on the horizon. Joe Biden was in Israel and Palestine last month, and he effectively sort of made it known that there would be no effective peace process. The United States has no interest in contemplating any diplomatic initiative or investing any political capital in trying to solve this conflict. So the cycle continues. And as you mentioned correctly, it's the innocent civilians, largely and overwhelmingly Palestinian, who pay the colossal price.
It seems that Egypt always plays the peacemaker in these scenarios. And I just want to understand this because people point to Egypt in terms of perhaps even aiding and abetting in the blockade in Gaza.
Well, that's correct. I think Egypt's role here is really to prove that it can deliver services and provide a useful role to the United States and to Israel by brokering a ceasefire whenever conflict erupts. So it's really a disingenuous role that the dictatorship in Egypt is playing here. It participates in and is deeply complicit in the ongoing 15-year blockade of Gaza. But at the same time, it tries to broker a conflict, not because it's really interested in reducing Palestinian suffering, but largely, I think Egypt is interested in sending a message to the United States, which, sends Egypt over $1 billion a year, that it can play a role in reducing tensions whenever there's a flare-up of tensions. And so I think that's fundamentally what Egypt is all about. They have no interest in, supporting a just resolution of the Palestinian conflict. They're interested in their own narrow, internal concerns. I'm talking about the Egyptian military, and that's staying in power and pleasing the countries that financially back Egypt, primarily the United States.
So I think earlier on you asked the question, what happens next? Yes, there may be a ceasefire for now. Every time that there is a flare-up like this, do things shift? They never quite get back to where they were before each conflict.
Well, they do sort of return to conditions before the conflict, but things get collectively worse for the Palestinians. Number one, they lose many lives. You have destroyed buildings. I mean, there's still, many of the buildings that were ruined and destroyed in the May 2021 conflict have still not been rebuilt, in part because, Gaza is under an Egyptian and Israeli siege. So things return back to sort of normal in the sense that there's no, cross-border fire, but the Palestinians sink into deeper misery, particularly in Gaza. We're talking about a 15-year siege. We're talking about 2 million people living in an open-air prison with no sign of hope, no sign of sort of, a light at the end of the tunnel. If you look at the internal sort of reports from Gaza, large scale, reports of mass misery, rising suicides, deep despair. And how can you blame, the Palestinians from feeling that way, given the last 15 years of Israeli siege, and critically, the absence of any sort of peace process that can give the Palestinians a sense of hope. So these are the dark days of Palestinian history. The only positive thing that I can say that the Palestinians can take maybe a little bit of hope from is that global public opinion, including in the United States, and particularly within the American Jewish community, that has shifted significantly. It hasn't filtered its way up to politicians and to changing Western policy. But it's pretty clear, if you follow the debate, that global solidarity is on the side of the Palestinians. Israel now is widely viewed, including, by the way, by the South African government, as an apartheid state. And so the moral claims and the general solidarity of the average person, in global civil society, in a human rights, group is with the Palestinians. So that's a significant shift. But, politically speaking, and in terms of a just and lasting resolution of the conflict, there's no sign that that's going to happen anytime soon.
Professor Hashemi, it's always great talking to you. Your insights are greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. All right, that's Professor Nader Hashemi, who's the director at the Center of Middle East Studies, speaking to us about this conflict that's been raging in Israel and Gaza in the recent week. And there is a hope and a belief that a ceasefire will kick in this evening, and we'll be monitoring that story for you. Stay with us. Coming up, we take a look at the Kenyan elections. They're literally a couple of days away now, and who will be the next president of that country? Stay with us.